And I'm here with Rupert Russell, director of The Last Sacrifice, which is an absolutely fantastic documentary. But I'm actually astonished that you had never seen The Wicker Man until a couple of years ago. So how did you avoid it for so long?
It was just one of those films that we all have, those classics that you just never get around to watching. And for me, The Wicker Man was that. And it was an interesting time to see it as an adult in 2022, because I watched it and I thought this wasn't a horror movie about then, it was a horror movie about today.
In what respect? Elaborate.
Well, it's that speech that Howie gives on the rocks where he's pleading for his life and he's saying, don't you realise none of this is going to work? And everyone just looks at each other and goes, no, we're going to do it anyway. And I just feel that's sort of been Britain for the last kind of 5 or 6 years, really. But it's been me kind of shouting at the TV.
I'm amazed you really had never seen it. I mean, the fact that, that it's a classic. It's been on TV all the time, but you never ever got around to it.
I was a late comer to horror, and my favourite horror really for me is body horror. I love I love the psychology of it. I love Cronenberg. I love the idea of the inside coming to the outside and how that represents itself. And the visualization of psychology in cinema. So for me, folk horror was this kind of other thing that I wasn't as knowledgeable about.
So who told you about the Charles Walton case then? That you think would this
Sure. So what happened was I saw The Wicker Man. I was like, God, this film's amazing. Like, what is this fucking man? It's about Britain today. And I called up a friend of mine who's a brilliant writer at Telegraph and is an expert on all things 1970s, Tim Stanley, who's actually in the film. And he said, well, this was based on a real murder, right? The Wicker Man. There was this real murder that happened in the Cotswolds. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And that was the genesis of it. And then once I realised there had been this untold story, I thought that's a perfect subject for a documentary film.
Okay, I mean, obviously there's a lot of research out there already to be done, but I mean, how much did you go into it? And there's the Fabian of the Yard stuff. Did you go to Scotland Yard to look at stuff?
Yeah, I went to the National Archives and I looked through the original case files. The original case files on the murder are actually quite thin, and because it was 80 years ago, this Valentine's Day was the 80th anniversary of the murder, there's just not much there. But for me, that was an opportunity, because what we do in the film is that we take not just The Wicker Man, but all these other fantastic films of the late 60s and early 70s that the murder influenced and kind of created a kind of archetype which they all follow. And we use those films to tell the story. So when you're watching The Last Sacrifice, you're actually watching a kind of mixtape of this sort of wonderful era of kind of bonkers British cinema, that although you watch these films and think they might all be these sort of paranoid delusions and fantasies of the director, were actually all based on real shit that was happening in Britain, and that's what the film is.
I mean, things like what Witchfinder General, you mean, and Blood on Satan's
Exactly,
Claw,
the Witchfinder General, the Blood on Satan's Claw, the Plague of the Zombies, Twins
I'm glad
of Evil,
you like that. So
Demons of the Mind. There's
picked
so
out
many
two
of them.
of the best
Virgin
ones.
Witch. I mean, can't rattle them all off the top of my head, but there's definitely a lot of them. And they all relate to not just the murder in 1985, which was a kind of tabloid sensation that ran all through the 50s and 60s.
1945.
The murder happened in 1945, but the witchcraft conspiracy didn't start until the early 50s, when Margaret Murray went to Lower Quinton and spoke to the Birmingham Post and said, this has been done by witches. And that is when the witchcraft tabloid frenzy begins, and it rumbles on all the way through to the late 60s, and a book is written in 1968 called Murder by Witchcraft. And 1968 is, of course, really where folk horror really takes off, and especially the witchcraft aspect of it. But it wasn't the only thing that was happening. It was also the Wicca revival. You had Alexander's and his covens running around naked all around Notting Hill. You had the Hampstead crucifixion in 1969. You had the Highgate vampire in the early 1970s. So real occult Britain was really kind of exploding. At the same time, we have this unsolved mystery from 1945. And all of these things kind of collide and combine and sort of create British folk horror, which is what we all sort of love and celebrate today, and is still being made now.
You said you weren't really that interested in actually solving the murder because it's immaterial.
I really regret saying that. Now this is coming back to bite me. I'm very interested in what happened to Charles Walton, but what we found with the research is that there is nothing there. Right, so I mean, you can watch the film and you will know as much as anybody else about what happened in the murder, and I do believe that there was a village conspiracy of silence, and it's because of that conspiracy of silence we don't know anything.
And was it your father who helped? was your sort of inspiration to actually get into the film industry in the first place?
I mean, perhaps I wouldn't have thought about it as seriously if that wasn't the case. But my first career was really in academia.
Okay.
And because I was dyslexic, I wasn't super into writing stuff. And I grew up always with cameras. So for me, like, the visual medium was just came much more naturally. And so what frustrated me about academia was I didn't want to just write for other academics, which is what you're trained to do, to write for an audience of like 4 people. I just couldn't get my head around that. And so I want to make stuff that everybody can watch and appreciate and is accessible. And The Last Sacrifice is definitely that. It's definitely a crowd pleaser.
It really is. It's had great reviews. I know everyone here is really looking forward to seeing it. Thanks a lot, Rupert. Well, we'll see you on stage later.
Yeah, and thanks so much for having us. We really appreciate it.